Imagine a world where the skies pulse with warp energy, the ground trembles under unseen horrors, and a red-skinned demon with a hand made to crush fate itself steps into the heart of chaos. Every step he takes awakens forces that don't just want to kill, but to bend reality around him. Will Hellboy survive the nightmarish creatures, the whispers of a corrupting power, and the Imperium that fears him as much as his enemies? Or will the chaos of Warhammer 40K finally find a way to claim even him? A sudden shiver of heat crawled across the broken plains of the nameless world as Hellboy stumbled out of a rip in reality, boots scraping against iron-tinted soil that felt half alive. He didn't know who dragged him here, but the smell alone told him this place wasn't Earth, wasn't anywhere close. The air tasted metallic and angry, like a storm held on a leash. Red dust swirled around him, clinging to his coat, while the sky pulsed with colors he had no name for. He squinted at the jagged horizon, noticing distant silhouettes moving like restless ghosts. Whatever world this was, something old and mean lived in its bones, and the hair on his neck lifted as if whispering a warning he couldn't yet understand. Hellboy took a slow breath, feeling the heat rise from cracks in the ground that glowed faintly like veins of molten pain. Somewhere far off, artillery fire echoed, muffled but rhythmic, like an omen eating in the distance. His tail twitched as he scanned the terrain, his instincts sharpening in a way they only did when the supernatural was close. The ground beneath him vibrated, not violently, but like it breathed. He frowned, planting the right hand of doom into the dirt, feeling a sickening thrum pulse through it. It wasn't magic he recognized. It was something far more chaotic, raw, and hateful. The kind of energy that wanted to seep under your skin and take root. He muttered under his breath and began walking, each step crunching over bones half buried under the soil, as if entire battles had died here without being remembered. Strange symbols were carved into shattered stones nearby, twisting unnaturally when he tried to focus on them. They looked like they wanted to move, like they resented being looked at by something living. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to shake the creeping sense that this entire landscape was watching him, not observing, judging, as if it already decided he didn't belong and was trying to push him out. With every breath of hot wind, a faint whisper brushed his ears, not in any language he knew, but dripping with malice and curiosity. He turned sharply, gun drawn, though nothing stood behind him except shifting red sand. The whisper came again, softer this time, as if amused by his reaction. Hellboy exhaled slowly, tightening his grip. He'd heard voices before, ghosts, demons, ancient gods, but this felt different. It wasn't talking to him. It was probing him, testing how easily it could pry open his mind. He snarled, shaking it off as he trudged forward, determined not to be toyed with by whatever invisible eyes roamed the air like parasites. The sky flickered overhead, splitting briefly into a gaping wound of swirling colors that churned like boiling oil. Hellboy stopped, watching as the tear stitched itself shut almost instantly, leaving behind a faint aftertaste of psychic rot. He had no idea where he was, but he finally understood one thing. This world wasn't broken by accident. It was being eaten alive from the inside, and the thing chewing on it wasn't subtle. A distant roar rolled across the plains, followed by the thunder of something massive landing far beyond the horizon. Hellboy squared his shoulders, brushed red dust from his coat, and kept walking, knowing he'd find answers the same way he always did, by punching whatever monster showed up first. Hellboy didn't need magic to tell something was wrong with the air. The warp made itself known, the way a rotten room announces its stench before the door even swings open. A pressure settled on his chest with every step, like invisible hands pushing him backward. Colors he'd never seen flickered at the edge of his vision, twisting in ways that made no physical sense. The wind carried faint echoes of laughter, screams, and something in between, blending into a chorus that rose and fell unpredictably. His skin prickled as if small sparks were crawling beneath it, trying to claw upward. He rubbed his arm, knowing it wasn't his imagination. It was the place, the atmosphere, the unseen corruption that coated every inch of the world, like a film of madness waiting to seep in. He paused on a ridge of broken stone, staring into the shimmering haze stretching across the lowlands. The warp wasn't just energy, it was intent. It slithered through the landscape, coiling around debris, curling across craters, drifting like smoke from a fire too big to extinguish. Hellboy squinted as a shape formed inside the haze, a towering silhouette that warped, shrunk, grew, and twisted until it dissolved. He clenched his jaw, resisting the instinct to reach for his rosary or some charm meant to ward off the unknown. Those wouldn't help here. This wasn't a demon from Earth's deep pits, or an old god with a name scrawled in archaic texts. This was a storm of emotion and madness given form, a place where fear and hate gained sharp edges. As he continued walking, he noticed strange distortions pulsing around him, like reality itself couldn't decide which parts to keep. Rocks flickered between shapes, shadows stretched longer than they should, and for a moment he thought he saw his younger self standing beside him, staring with disappointed eyes before fading into dust. He cursed under his breath, shaking off the chilling hum that followed the vision. The warp was trying to read him, dig into him, confuse him with memories and fears. But Hellboy wasn't new to psychological games. Still, something about this corruption was deeper, older, like it wasn't simply influencing the world. It was rewriting the rules while grinning at its own handiwork. A sudden surge of psychic pressure hit him like a wave, forcing him to stagger. His horns, stubs though they were, burned faintly as if responding to an unwelcome touch. He grabbed his head, teeth clenched, feeling the warp clawing at his thoughts as though trying to slip inside. He heard whispers, clear this time, calling his name in 1,000 mismatched voices. Some begged, some mocked, some promised power wrapped in poison. He stumbled forward until the wave passed, leaving the taste of iron on his tongue. He spat into the dirt, shaking his head. He'd felt temptation before, dark prophecies tied to his blood, fates others wanted to force on him. But this temptation felt different. It was curious about him. It wanted to peel back his skin and read the stories written in his bones. The wind shifted abruptly, carrying with it a sound like distant chanting. Hellboy froze, listening closely as the voices rose and fell in unnatural harmony. The noise tugged at him from multiple directions, like a magnet pulling at his ribs. As he scanned the area, the sky above him rippled again, threads of warp energy unfurling like tendrils searching for something warm to latch onto. He backed up a step, realizing the corruption wasn't just poisoning the world, it was expanding, like an infection spreading across flesh, eager to swallow anything foolish enough to wander inside. He tightened the strap on his holster, eyes narrowing. Whatever the warp was, however vast or hungry, he wasn't going to let it crawl into his mind without a fight. Hellboy hadn't walked far before he spotted movement across the ridge. Armored figures in formation, their silhouettes sharp and disciplined against the warped landscape. Their armor was battered, but still imposing, painted in dull greens and marked with an Imperial symbol he didn't recognize. The moment they saw him, they froze like statues, rifles rising in perfect unison. Hellboy raised his hands slowly, trying to look less like a giant red demon wandering through a war zone, but the tension in the air thickened. He could almost hear the thoughts running through their minds. Whatever he was, they'd seen worse, but that didn't mean they weren't ready to shoot him to pieces. One soldier barked something in a harsh, clipped tone, and though Hellboy didn't know the language, the intent was clear. Stay back, or get riddled with holes. He stopped, taking a slow breath, resisting the urge to crack a joke that would definitely get him shot. The soldiers moved like they were carved from iron, unblinking, unmoving, and fully convinced he was some chaos-spawned horror. Their boots crunched in perfect rhythm as they tightened their formation, spreading out to flank him. Hellboy eased his weight backward, keeping his stance calm, but the right hand of doom tingled with the familiar readiness of a situation about to go south. The soldiers' eyes, cold behind their visors, never left him. They didn't see a man or a stranger. They saw a threat poking at the edges of a battlefield corrupted by nightmares. And no one in the Imperium took chances with unknown creatures. The first shot cracked through the air like a warning from the heavens. A burst of lasfire sizzled past Hellboy's shoulder, scorching the dirt beside him. He snapped his head toward the shooter, his patience thinning. More shots followed, a barrage of disciplined fire, that forced him to dive behind a jagged chunk of stone. The ground flared where each beam struck, melting small craters into the already scarred soil. Hellboy clenched his jaw, gripping his Samaritan, not to kill, but to make them rethink the whole shoot-first policy. He considered yelling that he wasn't their enemy, but the thunder of rifles drowned out every thought except survival. He rolled out from behind the rock, firing a single warning shot into the air. The massive gun's recoil jarred his arm, echoing across the plains like a cannon blast. The Imperials hesitated, just long enough for Hellboy to step into the open with his hands raised again. The firing stopped, replaced by a thick silence, heavy with confusion and suspicion. One of the soldiers approached slowly, posture rigid, weapon still aimed at Hellboy's chest. The man's voice came filtered through a helmet speaker, harsh and wary, demanding an explanation Hellboy couldn't give. He shrugged, tapping his chest and pointing at the sky, making it as clear as possible he didn't belong here and wasn't part of the corruption creeping across the land. The soldiers exchanged glances, communicating through subtle gestures Hellboy couldn't decipher. Finally, the one closest lowered his rifle a fraction. Not trust, but hesitation. Hellboy felt the warp hum behind him again, a pulse that rippled through the air like a warning. The soldiers stiffened, weapons snapping upward toward the shifting haze gathering on the horizon. Whatever was out there, it scared them, and these weren't men easily rattled. For a moment, they seemed to forget about him entirely as they braced for an unseen threat. Hellboy exhaled, dusting off his coat, realizing they might not know what he was, but they knew what real danger looked like. And judging by their sudden fear, something far worse than him was coming their way. The Imperials had barely regrouped when a distant rumble rolled across the broken plains, a sickening vibration that crawled up Hellboy's spine. The soldiers snapped into formation instantly, rifles raised at the far edge of the valley, where a cluster of ruined structures stood half swallowed by drifting red fog. The strange chanting floated through the air, rhythmic and feverish, like a choir of twisted throats praising something ancient and hungry. Hellboy took a few steps toward the sound, feeling the heat rise from the ground again. The warp thickened around them, swirling in sick little spirals, as if celebrating something's arrival. He exchanged a look with the nearest soldier, who seemed too trained to show fear, yet too human to hide the tremor in his stance. They moved cautiously toward the ruins, picking their way over cracked skulls and ritual markings carved into slabs of stone. The chants grew clearer, rough voices rising in frenzied devotion, words dripping with madness. Hellboy narrowed his eyes, recognizing the pattern, even if the language was unfamiliar. He'd heard cults chant before, on Earth or beyond, and he knew the sound of desperation wrapped around blind worship. As they approached, figures emerged from the fog. Robed silhouettes with jagged knives, their faces hidden behind masks shaped like grinning daemons. They didn't run, didn't hide. Instead, they welcomed Hellboy and the soldiers with raised arms, ecstatic in the presence of what they believed was another demonic ally. Hellboy muttered something unpleasant under his breath as the cultists screamed praises, their voices cracking as if their throats were being carved open from the inside. The spell broke the moment a cultist lunged forward, blade dripping with an oily sheen of warp corruption. The Imperials opened fire instantly, beams of red light slicing through the fog, dropping cultists in frantic bursts. Hellboy stepped into the chaos, smashing a charging zealot aside with the right hand of doom, feeling bone crunch under the impact. The fanatics shrieked as they swarmed, knives flashing with unnatural speed. Only shadows melting into darkness, bloodshot eyes wide with ecstasy rather than fear. One grabbed Hellboy's coat but was hurled into a collapsing pillar, the stone exploding on impact. More cultists flooded from the ruins, stumbling over each other in their frenzy to spill blood for their unseen master. Hellboy fired his Samaritan into the crowd, each shot blasting a cultist off their feet with brutal finality. The air crackled as warp energy began to surge, reacting to the violence like a predator tasting fresh blood. The chanting grew louder, even as the cultists fell, their dying voices merging into a feverish chorus that sent tremors through the earth. Hellboy felt a pressure behind his eyes, a subtle push, as if the warp itself were trying to force a vision into his mind. He ignored it, smashing another attacker aside, coat whipping behind him as he moved through the battle. Laser fire lit the ruins, casting twisted shadows that danced across the walls like they were alive. A cultist covered in ritual scars crawled toward Hellboy, whispering promises of destiny and power before he silenced the man with a single heavy blow. The ground beneath them swelled unnaturally, rippling like skin over a shifting muscle. A gash of violet light tore open between the stones as the remaining cultists dropped to their knees, raising their arms toward the tear as if welcoming a god. The Imperials stumbled back, shouting warnings as the rift expanded, pulsing with nauseating colors. Hellboy shielded his face from the psychic blast that followed, debris swirling upward as if sucked toward an invisible maw. From within the rift came a wet, guttural roar, something massive dragging itself closer to the opening. The last surviving cultist laughed until his voice cracked, screaming that the sacrifice was complete. Hellboy gritted his teeth, stepping forward with the right hand of doom clenched tight, realizing this wasn't just a cult gathering. This was an invitation, and something from the other side had finally decided to answer. The rift swelled like a living wound in the world, its edges warping and folding as something enormous forced its way through. Hellboy braced himself as a clawed limb burst out first, dripping with shimmering ichor that hissed when it touched the stone. The Imperials fired desperately, beams slicing through the fog, but the creature barely flinched. Hellboy stepped forward, planting his feet as the hulking daemon finally tore free, a grotesque amalgamation of muscle, teeth, and writhing tendrils stitched together by raw warp energy. Its eyes fixed on him immediately, recognizing something familiar in the right hand of doom. Hellboy rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck as the massive fist glowed faintly in response, awakening like it sensed a worthy opponent. The daemon lunged with terrifying speed, its talons carving trenches in the ground as Hellboy met it head-on. The impact sent a shockwave through the ruins, dust and debris whipping outward as their clash shook the stones beneath them. Hellboy's right hand slammed into the creature's chest, the blow echoing like a thunderclap. But the monster only reeled back before roaring in defiance. It retaliated with a swipe that hurled Hellboy across the courtyard, his body smashing into a broken column hard enough to split it in half. He grunted, pushing himself up as the creature charged again, each step causing the ground to crack open. The soldiers scattered, firing into its flanks to draw its attention, but the daemon stayed locked on Hellboy, snarling like it had found the challenge it craved. Hellboy dodged another strike, sliding under its arm to hammer the right hand into its jaw. The daemon's head snapped sideways, teeth shattering as the blow sent ripples through its warped flesh. Its tendrils whipped around him, one catching his leg and flinging him upward toward the sinking sky. He twisted midair, firing a round from the Samaritan straight into the daemon's eye. The explosion of bone and warp fluid, sending the monster reeling. Hellboy landed hard, coughing as he steadied himself. The daemon bellowed, its wound knitting itself shut, fueled by the warp's endless hunger. But every time Hellboy's right hand struck, its body stuttered, shrinking back as if the artifact's presence disrupted its regeneration. He tightened his grip, realizing the creature wasn't just afraid of the fist. It was in pain because of it. The demonic energy surged around them, turning the fog into a violent whirlpool of colors. Hellboy felt the hum of the warp pressing into his skull, offering him strength, promising him dominance over the creature, if he'd only let it in. He snarled back at the unseen whispers, smashing his fist into the ground to steady himself. The impact sent cracks snaking across the courtyard, and the daemon stumbled as the earth buckled beneath it. Hellboy charged, ignoring the burning in his muscles, as he slammed the right hand into the monster's torso with all the force he could muster. The daemon's body convulsed, its form flickering like a dying flame. The soldiers seized the opening, unleashing a barrage of fire that tore chunks of warp flesh free, their resolve bolstered by the impossible sight of the creature weakening. The demon screeched, its form unraveling as Hellboy delivered one final crushing blow, driving the right hand into its skull. The creature exploded into a shower of molten energy that scorched the ground, the rift behind it flickering violently as if panicking at the loss of its champion. Hellboy staggered back, smoke rising from his fist. the raw heat making his coat smolder at the edges. He steadied himself, chest heaving, eyes locked on the collapsing portal as the warp hissed in frustration. The soldiers watched him with a mixture of awe and fear, the battlefield silent except for the lingering echo of the demon's death. The right hand of doom pulsed once, then went still, as if satisfied with what it had done. For a moment, after the daemon's collapse, the battlefield fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. Hellboy stood still, shoulders heaving, staring into the faint shimmer where the rift had been. But the warp wasn't finished with him. A cold whisper slithered across the back of his mind, softer this time, almost comforting. It spoke without words, offering quiet promises wrapped in velvet darkness. He felt a tug inside his chest, subtle but persistent, like a hook catching a thread of his soul. The warp didn't just tempt with power, it tempted with belonging. It leaned into the cracks of doubt he rarely acknowledged, with a voice that sounded disturbingly like his own, urging him to stop resisting the destiny tied to his blood. His hand tightened around the Samaritan as he forced the whisper down, jaw clenched, knowing he'd heard offers like this before, but never from something this vast. The pressure grew thicker around him, enough that the edges of reality seemed to bend inward, folding around his silhouette like a cloak stitched from shadow. The warp's presence wasn't violence now. It was patient, seductive, studying him the way a collector examines a rare artifact. He felt memories rise, his childhood in the BPRD, missions that left scars, choices that haunted him on quiet nights. All twisted just slightly, reshaped to make him question what he'd fought for. The voice murmured that he didn't need to carry the weight of expectation, that the power in his veins could remake worlds instead of defending them. Each temptation sank deeper, slipping through the cracks in his thoughts. Even his right hand of doom pulsed faintly, reacting to the warp's attention like it recognized the same hunger wearing a different face. Hellboy stumbled back, gripping his head as the visions sharpened. He saw the Imperium burning, but not by chaos, by his own hand, raised high like a king crowned in fire. He saw Daemons kneeling, worlds reshaped under a crimson shadow. He saw himself not as a weapon of fate, but as the architect of something terrible and magnificent. The warp pushed harder, feeding the images with intoxicating detail. He could feel the warmth of the flames, the weight of a crown, the thrill of absolute control. His breath quickened, the seductive pressure coiling around him like smoke. The soldiers nearby shouted, but their voices sounded impossibly distant, drowned beneath the honeyed whisper that urged him to take what the universe always feared he might claim. He dropped to one knee, the earth cracking beneath him as the visions refused to fade. The voice, his voice, promised freedom from doubt, from judgment, from the destiny others tried to shape for him. It told him he was born for more than fighting monsters. He was born to command them. A swirling aura flickered around him, the warp testing how far it could slip into his thoughts. He felt its tendrils scraping gently at the edges of his mind, looking for a door left unlocked. His right hand vibrated with a dangerous resonance, reacting like a tuning fork struck by an unseen force. The heat around him rose until sweat rolled down his neck, and the stones beneath him glowed with faint red lines that pulsed like veins. The world felt thinner, stretched, as if reality waited to see which way he'd fall. Then, with a growl deep in his chest, Hellboy forced himself upright, shaking his head violently as if tearing cobwebs from his brain. He swung the right hand of doom into the ground, the impact sending a shockwave that scattered the lingering warp haze. The visions shattered instantly, dissolving into smoke as he exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The pressure faded, but not fully. The warp didn't retreat in anger. It withdrew like a predator, amused by the resistance. Only shadows melting into darkness, whispering that it would return, stronger and smarter. Hellboy steadied himself, wiping blood from his nose, knowing he hadn't banished the temptation, only survived its first taste. The soldiers stared at him in stunned silence, unaware that while they had fought cultists and daemons, Hellboy had just fought something far more dangerous, the part of himself the warp wanted to claim. The silence that followed felt heavier than the battle itself, broken only by the crackling of scorched stone and the labored breathing of soldiers who still couldn't decide whether Hellboy was a savior or a threat. Their eyes followed him cautiously as he wiped the dust from his coat, the right hand of doom still faintly warm from the fight. Before anyone spoke, the ground trembled again, not from chaos, but from the disciplined march of armored giants emerging through the smoke. Space Marines, their armor etched with purity seals and battle scars, stepped into view with the weight of legends carved into every movement. Hellboy tensed instinctively, knowing these weren't men who entertained uncertainty. Their helmets swiveled toward him, lenses glowing like the eyes of judgment itself, assessing whether he was worth sparing or purging. The Marines approached with machine-like precision, their presence electrifying the air. Even the Imperial Guardsmen straightened at the sight of them, fear and reverence fighting for dominance on their faces. The tallest Marine stepped forward, his voice a deep, metallic growl that felt like it rattled inside Hellboy's ribs. He demanded identification, intent, origin, questions Hellboy couldn't answer without sounding insane. He raised his hands slowly, gesturing toward the rift residue, toward the corpse soup smear where the daemon had been. The Marines paused, glancing at the Guardsmen, who nodded shakily in confirmation. The giant warrior examined Hellboy again, and for a moment, the tension thickened, as if the entire world held its breath, waiting to see if they would open fire. Instead, the Marine turned sharply, activating a Vox link with a curt command. Moments later, he spoke again, announcing that their objective aligned with Hellboy's accidental arrival: the eradication of a growing chaos infestation threatening multiple sectors. The rift he had helped close was only one of many. Hellboy's eyebrows raised slightly at the phrasing. Accidental arrival was putting it mildly, but the implication was clear. They didn't trust him, but they needed him. The warp's reaction to his right hand hadn't gone unnoticed. The Marines formed a half-circle around him, not in camaraderie, but containment, ensuring he was protected and watched. Hellboy shrugged, holstering the Samaritan, figuring cooperation was better than being vaporized by walking tanks. They moved together across the blasted terrain, heading toward the nearest transport zone. The Marines navigated the landscape like they were born in it, reading every scorch mark and scent of corruption. Hellboy followed, senses prickling as remnants of warp energy flickered in the air. Despite their stoic facades, he noticed how the Marines subtly positioned themselves whenever the warp pulsed, shielding the Guardsmen, bracing for attacks, calculating threats with inhuman precision. Yet even among warriors bred for war, he felt eyes lingering on him. His presence was an anomaly, a red-skinned wild card walking beside symbols of absolute order. One Marine, armor marked with a skull insignia, stared longer than the others, as if he sensed something Hellboy was trying to ignore. The warp hadn't stopped whispering to him. As they neared the extraction point, the distant roar of another warp disturbance echoed across the horizon, a sound like a star screaming. The Marines shifted instantly, weapons ready, formation tightening around Hellboy, whether he liked it or not. He felt the right hand pulse again, not with temptation this time, but purpose, as if it recognized the coming threat before he did. The Marines prepared for deployment, their leader giving a single nod toward Hellboy, a silent acknowledgement that for now, he was part of this fight. He didn't belong to their empire, their faith, or their ideals. But whatever chaos was rising, it seemed the universe had decided he'd be standing beside them when it arrived. The warp disturbance ahead grew like a bruise spreading across the sky, an ugly slash of violet and black that pulsed with sickening rhythm. Hellboy marched beside the Marines, feeling the air vibrate as if reality was thinning under invisible claws. The ground trembled with each pulse, dust rising in gentle shivers that made the landscape look like it was breathing. The Marines formed a wedge, weapons ready, their focus absolute. Hellboy's right hand of doom tingled with building heat, the same kind he felt when standing too close to something ancient and wrong. Distant roar rolled across the valley, deep enough to shake bone. The Marines paused, only for a breath, before pushing forward, and Hellboy followed, trying not to think about the familiar dread gathering in his stomach. As they climbed a ridgeline of shattered rock, the source of the roar finally revealed itself. A colossal shape emerged from the warp storm, its outline flickering like a nightmare, struggling to stay solid. The greater daemon towered above the ruins, wings unfurled in shreds of shadow, horns curling like molten iron, claws long enough to pierce tanks. Its body writhed with chaotic symbols, glowing like embers trapped under skin. Hellboy felt its gaze hit him like a physical weight, burning through the air with malignant curiosity. He'd fought monsters, gods, even destiny. But this thing radiated power that made the world itself recoil. The Marines didn't flinch, raising their bolters in perfect unity, chanting litanies under their breath. Hellboy just tightened his jaw, adjusting his grip on the Samaritan, knowing bullets wouldn't be enough to bring this thing down. The daemon roared again, the sound ripping through the sky and sending shockwaves that knocked smaller stones into the air. Hellboy staggered, but held his ground as the creature lunged forward, its claws tearing trenches through the earth. The Marines opened fire, a storm of explosive rounds slamming into its hide, with bursts of light and smoke. But the beast only snarled, enraged more than harmed. Hellboy dashed toward it, boots churning dirt as he rolled under a sweeping claw that would have sliced him clean in half. His right hand slammed into the daemon's leg with a sound like a crashing boulder, sending ripples through its corrupt flesh. The creature recoiled, black ichor splattering the ground in chunks that hissed as they dissolved into vapor. Its glowing eyes narrowed at him, and Hellboy felt the full weight of its hatred focus entirely on his presence. The daemon unleashed a wave of psychic force, a blast so intense Hellboy felt his bones vibrate. The Marines braced behind energy shields, their armor shaking as cracks spiderwebbed across the ground. Hellboy was thrown back, skidding through dirt and shattered stone, until his back hit a broken pillar, hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. The warp surged again, twisting the air around the daemon as it stomped toward him. Each step rippling reality. Hellboy struggled to rise as the creature raised one massive claw, its edges shimmering with warp energy, sharp enough to tear the soul rather than flesh. His vision blurred, spots flickering at the edges as whispers slithered into his ears, urging him to submit, to bow, to embrace the monstrous destiny the warp had carved for him. The right hand glowed brighter, reacting violently to the daemon's aura, vibrating with heat that bordered on pain. Roaring through the pressure crushing his chest, Hellboy surged upward and slammed the right hand into the daemon's descending claw. The impact shattered the corrupted limb, spraying warp fire across the battlefield. The Marines seized the opening, unleashing coordinated volleys that tore chunks from the daemon's torso. The greater daemon recoiled, stumbling backward with a furious, wounded howl. Hellboy didn't let it regain balance. He charged again, driving the right hand into the beast's abdomen with enough force to crack its core. The daemon's body spasmed, its form flickering between solidity and raw warp essence. Its wings collapsed inward as it thrashed, trying to pull away. But Hellboy held on, pushing harder, ignoring the searing heat burning his arm. The daemon screeched, its voice splitting the air as its body detonated in a burst of crimson light, dissolving into a storm of ash and warp embers that rained down like dying stars. The battlefield was still trembling from the Daemons' collapse when Hellboy felt another ripple of warp energy wash over him. Less violent this time, but sharper, like a needle slipping under the skin. He steadied himself, breathing in the scorched air as the Marines regrouped. The psychic residue was thick, hanging like fog, carrying fragments of corrupted rituals that whispered in broken syllables. Hellboy clenched his jaw, scanning the ruins. He knew raw strength alone wouldn't be enough to stop what was spreading across this world. Chaos wasn't just brute force. It was manipulation, symbolism, and dark rituals carved into reality itself. That was territory he understood better than most. His work with the BPRD had taught him how to read occult traces the same way a tracker followed footprints. And what he sensed now made his skin crawl. He crouched beside a half-melted altar, dragging his fingers through the ash and shattered glyphs. The symbols weren't just scrawled, they were carved with purpose, forming a ritual far older than the cultists who screamed it into motion. Every curve and jagged line pulsed faintly, resonating with the warp's lingering hunger. Hellboy muttered to himself, recognizing fragments similar to ancient demon-binding practices, but twisted into something grotesque. These weren't meant to summon a daemon. They were meant to anchor one. The cult hadn't just called the greater daemon. They had prepared a lattice of ritual anchors spread across the region, binding the rift to the world like hooks sunk into flesh. Even with the daemon gone, the anchors still pulsed with malevolent life. Hellboy felt the weight of it pressing against his mind, a network of corruption waiting to reawaken. He moved through the ruins, ignoring the Marines' cautious stares, examining burnt scrolls and broken idols. The artifacts hummed with warped energy, their forms stretching and trembling as if resisting being looked at. Hellboy picked up a charred tablet, its surface etched with a ritual sequence that made his stomach clench. It wasn't just chaos magic. It was an inversion of protective sigils he recognized from Earth's occult traditions, corrupted to trap rather than repel. Someone in this cult had knowledge they shouldn't have. Someone mixed practices from multiple eras and dimensions, binding them into a lattice that could reopen the rift even stronger. Hellboy crushed the tablet in his hand, sparks of warp energy sizzling between his fingers. The Marines stiffened at the sudden burst, but Hellboy ignored them, piecing the ritual together in his mind. He needed to break the anchors before the warp regained enough strength to tear open another wound. The Marines followed him cautiously as he tracked the corrupted pathways threaded across the ruins. Each anchor point he discovered was more complex than the last. Blood sigils fused with bone shards, runes carved into the earth itself, ritual grids drawn with an unsettling precision no frenzied cultist should possess. Hellboy felt a familiar ache building behind his eyes as he absorbed each detail, piecing together the ritual like a puzzle assembled by a lunatic. His right hand of doom responded to the corruption, glowing faintly whenever he neared an anchor, reacting as though it recognized the unnatural pattern. With each anchor he destroyed, the air lightened slightly, the warp's grip loosening like a claw reluctantly withdrawing. But the resistance grew stronger, the ground vibrating as if protesting the unraveling of its chained corruption. Hellboy wiped sweat from his brow, knowing the cult's work ran deeper than surface symbols. The final anchor sat at the heart of the ruins, a spiraling pit lined with molten glyphs that writhed like living flesh. Hellboy approached slowly, feeling the warp hum like a heartbeat beneath the stone. The pit radiated power, its energy swirling upward in faint tendrils that tried to coil around his thoughts. He gripped the edge with his normal hand, while the right hand pulsed brighter than ever. He felt the ritual fighting him, trying to twist his will, offering him secrets, power, understanding of the fabric of chaos itself. He growled, slamming the right hand into the center of the anchor with all his strength. The ground erupted in a blinding flash as the ritual lattice shattered, sending a deafening psychic shockwave across the valley. The warp energy screamed as it bled away, leaving the ruins silent. Hellboy staggered back, chest rising and falling, knowing he hadn't just broken a spell. He'd severed a chain, meant to pull something far worse into the world. The shockwave faded slowly, leaving behind a heavy quiet, broken only by the distant groan of settling stone. Hellboy blinked through the drifting dust, every muscle aching from the force of the anchor's collapse. The Marines steadied themselves, forming a defensive perimeter as they scanned the ruined valley for any sign of lingering warp presence. But the oppressive weight that had clung to the world since Hellboy arrived had loosened, finning like smoke blown from a dying fire. Hellboy could feel it in his lungs. The air no longer tasted like corruption trying to crawl inside him. His right hand cooled, the glow dimming to its usual dormant ember, though he still sensed something watching him from the edges of reality. The warp never disappeared entirely. It just recoiled, always waiting for another opening. He walked forward, stepping over shattered glyphs and scorched earth, trying to assess whether the rift would return. The scars in the ground still pulsed faintly, but the energy bleeding from them weakened with each passing second. Hellboy crouched, placing his normal hand against the cracked stone. The vibration beneath it was fading, not surging, meaning the damage was contained. For now, he exhaled slowly, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. Stopping the ritual anchors had sealed this wound, but every instinct told him the warp hadn't given up. It had only retreated, licking its wounds, whispering from far-off dimensions with the patience of a predator that knew it would get another chance. Hellboy muttered to himself, wishing just once the universe would stop trying to pull him into its cosmic horror show. The Marines approached him, their massive shadows stretching across the ruined valley. The squad's leader stepped forward, helmet lenses glowing with quiet calculation as he studied Hellboy's stance. His weapon, the mark of soot across his jaw. The Marine's voice rumbled like distant thunder as he acknowledged the destruction of the ritual network and the sealing of the warp breach. But even in gratitude, the tone held caution, reminding Hellboy that the Imperium judged everything in absolutes. He was an unknown, a being that looked like a daemon, but fought like a guardian. The Guardsmen whispered behind their visors, unsure whether to salute him or avoid him. Hellboy scratched the back of his neck awkwardly, not knowing what to do with that kind of attention. Saving the day never softened the fact that he looked like something most people wanted to shoot. They moved together through the ruins, regrouping at the extraction point where the sky had finally begun to settle into something resembling normal. Though normal in this galaxy was still bleak, scarred, and carrying the constant scent of war. Hellboy glanced across the horizon, watching the clouds swirl in slow, heavy patterns. The warp residue trembled faintly at the edge of perception, like a presence pacing behind a locked door. He felt its lingering interest, a curiosity that hadn't disappeared when he shattered the ritual anchors. The warp remembered him now. It had seen the right hand of doom respond to its temptations, had sensed the potential it could twist if given enough cracks to slip through. That awareness unsettled him more than the battles themselves. He'd spent his whole life fighting who he was supposed to become. Now, an entire cosmic force wanted to test those limits. As the Marines signaled the incoming extraction craft, Hellboy stood slightly apart, gazing at the scorched earth where the rift once raged. He could still feel echoes of what might have happened, visions of devastation, worlds torn open, chaos spilling through like a tide. But he also felt something else, quieter, buried under the noise, a sense that his being here had changed the balance, even if only a fraction. He wasn't part of this universe, wasn't meant for its wars or its horrors, yet something in him resonated with the struggle. The Marines motioned him forward, offering him a place beside them, not with open trust, but with grudging respect earned the hard way. Hellboy stepped toward the gunship, boots crunching over broken stone, knowing this wasn't victory. It was only a pause in a story the warp intended to continue. But for now, the world was still standing, and that was enough.